Sadly, during the last 2 years, we have not been able to meet in person. And again, this year as well, at first we were hoping that you can join, but I think there are two, because of few challenges that the world has been facing, not just in Southeast Asia, not just because of COVID, but because of the war around, like at least in Russia that is happening at the moment. So it affects a lot of support for the cultural activities, and this has been, we also have been affected with this as well. So today we will have Professor Dieter Mack from Musikhochschule Lübeck, which we also have some friends together with us here. And thank you for sending them over. This has been extremely pleasant to be working with them for the last few days. So, and today, Dieter will be talking about cultural appropriation and cultural identity. Actually, Kars has been kindly suggested this discussion already over the lunch. So we'll just be extending our lunch into your presentation now. So Dieter, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very happy that I can talk to you, and I would have loved to be present in Bangkok, and as Anatay has already said, my German sponsor, the DAAD, German Academic Exchange Service, did stop all projects on short notice because there was a cut of financial support by the Foreign Department, and that caused that my traveling was not possible anymore at that moment. Okay. That's, Anatay has already mentioned the problems of our time. That's why I can hardly say celebrating the now. I must more say, I have to pose the question how to deal with the now. Consequently, I decided to investigate a topic that is perhaps like less visionary, but current or very now. The term cultural appropriation is not really new. But recently in Germany, a fierce debate has begun to rock the universities and various political and social groups. You may have heard of the movement Fridays for Future, founded by Greta Thunberg in 2018. It is a protest movement of mainly young people against the exploitation of nature, wasting limited resources, etc. No wonder that this movement tends to touch on other issues as well, but then often lacks necessary and strong foundation of further in-depth knowledge. Some weeks ago, a German musician called Ronja Malzahn was asked to perform during such a protest activity in Hanover. Shortly before, Fridays for Future representatives canceled the performance with the argument that the singer would wear so-called dreadlocks. This would be unacceptable cultural appropriation by white people, as dreadlocks are a symbol of Black people's protest against white supremacy in the US. The singer would have been allowed to perform if she were willing to cut her hair, what she in fact did not do. As you can imagine, a debate started which has not yet found an end and probably will never have. So let us now turn to this term cultural appropriation itself and begin with a quote by Patty Leonard and Peter Balint. Quote, why does my computer not want to work? Sorry. So. Yes, here's the quote. Sorry, there were some technical problems. Social media is full of accusations and counter-accusations of a wrong called cultural appropriation. These are directed at those who appear to be using the cultural practices of groups in which they are not members. All kinds of actions have been labeled as cultural appropriation. The teaching of yoga by people who cannot trace their descent to the Indian subcontinent, the wearing of cornrows by people who cannot trace their background to the African continent, Lady Gaga's wearing of a burqa in a music video, just to name a few. The anger on both sides of these debates is substantial, even if the clarity of what they are claiming is not. Many important questions remain unsatisfactorily answered. What is to culturally appropriate? End of the quote. In short, my answer is there is no answer, because the respective circumstances of meetings, adaptations, and exchanges are of importance, including the fact that in most cases we should speak about processes. They determine the respective form of appropriation, transfer, or blending, and only then evaluation makes sense, if at all. I will give some concrete examples in a moment. However, I must dwell on the fact that despite a few undisputable circumstances, the borders are always flexible and flowing. Even in individual cases, personal histories and experiences participate. However, I would not know any argument at all that justifies to depart from a radical and limiting essentialism viewpoint. Representatives of that culture police position turn a necessary critical position upside down into an almost fascist tendency of a one-sided radical. By that, they follow the fatal error that it is possible to create a better world through this one-sidedness. In fact, they impede exactly what they want to achieve, which is the unprejudiced acceptance of the other. How can I establish a position of acceptance if I do not have the possibility at all to investigate, learn, and dig into something other to learn something new? The argument of cultural repent for century-long shortcomings and cultural political atrocities by the Western world seems to me counterproductive as well. Mistakes of the past should certainly be addressed and investigated, but one cannot go back in time. In my extended talks with suppressed and forced colonized people, for example, in Indonesia, I rarely had the impression that they wanted to look back, except those who had personally suffered, for example, under the 1965 coup. The open admission of mistakes and the honest intention to make things better are best guarantees of an improved future exchange. As the whole issue has become a worldwide topic with numerous contributions and branches, allow me to focus just on two almost opposing authors that are considered authorities regarding cultural appropriation and cultural identity, at least in Europe. Lars Distelhorst, one of these two authors, states, according to all analyzed definitions, cultural appropriation is the unanimous takeover of elements of a suppressed culture by the members of a dominant culture. Although this should be a summarized and multi-adaptable definition, it evokes many questions as well. The word unanimous is understandable and relates to Distelhorst's opinion that, as a rule, the takeover happens on one-sidedly and mostly without any kind of approval of the exploited side. However, I already see some dark clouds in the sky. If we talk about material goods, it seems to be mostly acceptable if one would have to admit that the mode of how such a decision is made should be thematicized as well. Was it by free will? Was it in exchange with something else? Did the other side know what was about to happen? Did the other side just participate in that game? Or was it really a blunt stealing or misuse? The term becomes more difficult in case of an unconscious appropriation based on an encompassing occupation with various aspects of the other culture in demand, for example, in music. Who would be and able to distinguish between analogies and real transfers? The case of Debussy and gamelan has certainly been an analogy, despite many authors claim the opposite. The numerous exotisms of that time, the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, were perhaps more that kind of unanimous appropriation. But was it really an appropriation? Was it not more a symbolic, transcendental image of a foreign and faraway world, free from any kind of rating? It is also not important whether this summoning is correct in the widest sense of its meaning. It just triggers an association or image. One could criticize here that cliches, stereotypes, and prejudices are coined by that, but I do not believe that. It is only the summoning of something unknown, something far away, and it might even be completely wrong. The real reality is completely unimportant here. Therefore, it is also no injury nor an insult towards that other culture or that fiction of another, normally anonymous culture. It is just a metaphor of a certain expression. The musicologist Karl Dahlhaus writes, "It belongs to the nature of musical exotism that it can be integrated into the context of European composition, although it contravenes drastically against a rule in connection with a text or a scenic picture, recalling a non-European practice, even if half of the original meaning has been buried by counterpointed harmony. To judge exotisms based on ethnographic criteria is ill-conceived in any case. It is not important up to which degree the exotism is authentic. The function is important as a legitimate deviation from an aesthetical and compositional normative of European music in connection with an opera or symphonic poem. The object of analysis should less be the original context where it came from, but rather the artificial one where it has been inserted. Musical exotism is, expressed stereotypically, a functional term and not one of substance." End of the quote. If one feels obliged to regard the process described by Dahlhaus as cultural appropriation, we can really bury the complete music history or end the debate. Especially the principle music about music has an important place in Western music history, and not only there. I will return to that later. But now one may still argue that the vision of foreign worlds and cultures was, and partly is, only possible on the foundations of all those colonial atrocities done by Europeans over centuries. And certainly, also the often cited World Exhibition from 1889 has an exploiting background that must be regarded critically. The voyeuristic aspect is a negative tendency that cannot be denied. Yes, this is all true. However, we can also not deny that at the same time, people from different cultures came closer together and started to understand each other, or at least they tried that. I also want to recall that colonial actions have not been an exclusive behavior of European cultures and nations towards others. If you look closer at, for example, the history of Southeast Asia itself, internal colonialist and imperialistic attitudes are obvious, at least since we have started to document history. And here I just would like to quote my friend Jonas Beiss, who wrote me when we discussed that topic in an email 2 months ago, quote, "The more pressing issue for the former colonies like the Philippines is the feudal nature of society that keep us plunged into the peripheries of the global political economy." That's exactly what I mean with my own statement. A politicization of a procedure as described by Dahlhaus seems to be less relevant because there are no value at stakes. The question of a potential suppression can only, if at all, be discussed on an individual level of each one who has been affected. But I cannot connect individual action with an overall political issue. The following music examples will demonstrate a little these different aspects. I will start with one which fulfills exactly that what Dahlhaus explained as exotism, and is something which is only relevant in the European context without any idea of cultural appropriation. Okay, just until here, it's a quite long section from Benjamin Britten's opera Prince of the Pagodas. The opposite of that would be the following example.
Expressions of surprise transmitted to another age beyond where eyes can see. Solitude.
Hello, Pak Dieter.
Transmitted to another.
Okay, so far, this example is one of my favorite ones because I participated in the production. Musically, cultural appropriation is completely obvious. Also, it has been presented as a result of the meeting of cultures. In the liner notes, it says, quote, "In transmission," that's the name of the album, "a new musical form has been found by a blending of two cultures and the dissolving of the traditional structures of Balinese music." End of the quote. In reality, we have two musical worlds that have nothing to do with each other. Moreover, the part of the Balinese has only been integrated, in word commas, electronically and not as an exotism a la Dalhouse. The Balinese were used as a mere sound source. Any kind of aesthetical substance is obsolete. The Balinese were reduced to the in and out movements by a fader on the mixing desk. Here we do not need the dichotomy between dominant and suppressed culture, although it sounds like that. The dominant electronics of the Western side and the suppressed Balinese gamelan by that electronic media. Interestingly, the Balinese themselves did not care and did not feel suppressed at all. They were just happy to play. I also have to add, to be honest, that the Balinese had been treated in the best possible way, like good friends, by the responsible Western persons. There was no feeling of a cultural gradient at all. And now a third musical example, a very interesting one. Oh. No. Okay, so just this small excerpt. Musically, it sounds like a contemporary Balinese gamelan piece, and any Balinese audience would judge it from that point of view. However, the piece was composed by the American composer Michael Tenzer, an outspoken specialist of contemporary Balinese gamelan. Seen from the musical matter, it would be cultural appropriation because Tenzer has fully intruded into the Balinese world of music, but without having a Balinese cultural background, at least by birth. For me, this is definitely no cultural appropriation because Tenzer is such a high-class specialist, has lived in Bali for years, and is fully accepted as an equal partner by the Balinese. In other words, he has integrated a certain amount of the Balinese consciousness into his own one. Here, the terms dominant or suppressed culture seem to be completely obsolete because everything is happening on the same level. It is a good example as well for a unique cultural exchange at its best, where a long-term experience, a thorough artistic and cultural investigation has led to fruitful results. Now, back again to this previous quote from Lars Distelhorst. The next question would be what Distelhorst means with the two words suppressed culture and dominant culture. Here, I must mention that this author applies a quite totalitarian and superficial understanding of the respective cultural realms. He explains or justifies it with the necessity that only by this simplification he would be able to maintain his line of argumentation. But at the same time, he has already a clear image of the respective belonging, because it is obvious that the author comes from the corner of capitalist criticism. And at many other points, it becomes clear dominant cultures are only means Western ones, namely the G7 countries. This is a very limited and polarized view because methods and structures of internal suppression are much more drastic and violent, for example, in Russia and China. And I do not want to make a list here on similar problems on an even lower scale worldwide. But all these problems are completely omitted by that author. Unfortunately, most of that worldwide debate on cultural appropriation and identity is signified by such polarizing and superficial statements. Many authors have never had an in-depth living experience in other countries or cultures, but writing about them is suddenly justified as long as it fits into the overall ideology. Is Indonesia a poor country? Based on that current debate, I have to say yes. A country that even was a colony of the Dutch, shortly one of Japan, which means it was suppressed. And by that, the main cliche of critics of cultural appropriation is served. But is that all? First, in today's cultural realm of Indonesia, there have been constantly numerous battles of power between many ethnic groups. The Dutch just had to join. Apparently, regional colonization already took place on a lower level before the European colonial forces became active. It does not justify their behavior, but it demonstrates the real complexity. In today's Indonesia, the difference between rich and poor is much more extreme and cannot be compared with Europe. Secondly, the social unbalance in the country itself is much more evident regarding dominant and suppressed subcultures. One may criticize again that even today's local situation is a result of the colonial times. And then during the independence fights, Western political systems have just been imitated because it seemed to be easier. However, in my eyes, such an opinion is too simple and limited. Finally, Distelhorst provides a revised definition of cultural appropriation. He says, cultural appropriation intervenes in disputes about hegemony when members or groups of the dominant culture use the symbols of those struggling discriminated groups. Furthermore, those symbols are recoded for own purposes or are changed into consumers' articles. By that, their meaning has deviated and cannot be used anymore for the original representation. Can I be happier now? I don't think so. The author seems to have an understanding of meeting of cultures or their respective representatives, which is generally characterized by the search of hegemony. This may not become fully clear in this quote above, because he solely writes about dominant and discriminated cultures. Distelhorst seems to divide the world in those two groups and nothing else. He even justifies the opposite, cultural appropriation by the suppressed cultures towards the dominant ones. I would have no problems with that, but if cultural appropriation has been defined as mentioned by Distelhorst above, it must work in any direction apart from that dichotomy, dominant and suppressed. For me, most of the debate is a dangerous simplification and in total contrast to the complex reality of this world. Here's another example. The big gong agang is in Bali, the center of the gamelan, where the spirit of the music has its place. Therefore, there are various rules how to treat a gong. Does it mean if I use that gong in my Western music, I have conducted a cultural appropriation? Did I recode a symbol from others or even make it a consumer's product? I think none of this is true. The crucial point is that for the Balinese, there are two sides. Only in the moment a music is played in its special, ritual context, the symbolic function takes place. But I do not use that culturally contextual meaning, as I do not play Balinese ceremonial music, but my own. Secondly, the Balinese have a clear consciousness about secularization. In the moment the gong is not used in its special cultural or religious context, that spirit is, so to speak, neutral, and it is only a question of a worthy treatment as an instrument. Distelhorn's position is too much signified by his basic critique of capitalism, and the latter is represented exclusively by the West. Why he takes this extremely limited stance, I do not know. He also argues similarly for a cultural identity. If cultural appropriation tends to damage identity, we have to clarify first what identity really is. Then we may ask how we can protect and defend it. Therefore, in sociology is regarded as an interplay between a social and a personal part. Identity asks for a permanent occupation with oneself and continuously asks for compromises between social conformity and uniqueness. Therefore, it is a very fragile construction. Though Distelhorst acknowledges the fragility of the concept of identity, he tends to propagate cultural identity as an individual tool to belong to something, a group, a religion, an ideology. He concedes that such an identity is changing, but only as a second step. For him, social and cultural identity is an important tool in the struggle between the dominant and the suppressed culture. Although I understand the author, I think it is more appropriate to avoid that way of defining humans as being in special cultural biotopes, because this is exactly what happens. We are back in the realm of fundamental essentialism, where a certain group of people is precisely defined. Only people originating from that realm are then allowed to address something inside of that group. Their legitimation is the external or also internal attribution of defined characteristics and behaviors. It is my thorough conviction that humankind must fully overcome such limiting tendencies because it impedes any kind of exchange and communication. Let's come now to the second person with a completely different approach. It's François Julien, a French philosopher and sinologist who wrote a challenging small book called There Is No Cultural Identity. Already in the beginning, he formulates, only when we are able to support a togetherness that is no reduction to the uniform, the common of that community will be active. I like that statement because it says that diversity is important and the common or the universal is not the uniform. This is different to Distelhorst, who concedes various factors constructing cultural identity. But in the end, he dwells on some uniform elements, whatever they are, mostly economic ones, I think. Distelhorst argued that what often gives identity to suppressed society in their eternal fight against the dominant culture is the uniform. This is, a typical socialist philosophy, strongness in togetherness, even with the uniform clothing. And then the uniform becomes perhaps the symbol of the struggle. And if that symbol is used, or in the word of Distelhorst, is recoded by someone commonly from the dominant culture, negative cultural appropriation has taken place. But for me, diversity and real individuality were buried first in favor of the uniform. I prefer diversity. I'm afraid of uniformity. Julien then poses the question, what happens with the opposite of the universal? The universal is not the uniform. With the opposite of the universal, what is the singularity? He continues that in Europe, generally, the two words difference and identity are applied. I agree with him that these are dangerous words. For him, identity tends to cultural essentialism for single persons, determined internally and externally. He would rather suggest the term cultural resources. This term seems to be more neutral and flexible, while identity always asks for defined criteria and, see above, by that put a potential open consciousness into a calculated framework. For the term difference, he suggests the term distance, because distance refers to the in-between of two different resources and does not ask for defined criteria that determine the differences. In most cases, I'm fully on the side of Julien, but can it be successful just by suggesting two new words? I strongly doubt it. While resources still owns a certain logic, distance implies an abstraction that is not quickly obvious. However, Julien's arguments are striking. The attempt to describe the diversity of cultures in terms of differences, unfortunately, has the consequence that cultures become isolated in their respective identity. But this is impossible because the cultural is especially signified by mutations and changes. A culture that does not change is dead. Transformation is the source of the cultural, and therefore it is impossible to fix cultural characteristics or to speak from the identity of a culture. I fully agree with Julien, but I would add that each member of a cultural realm has its own living consciousness with a feeling of a personal identity, which is certainly continuously in transition as well. Finally, some words again to music. Music developments all over the world are signified by exchange, transformation, borrowings, hybridizations, etc. I even do not dare to mention one single music culture, whether it is defined geographically or even socially, that is not the result of continuous exposure to others. And that exposure is not necessarily cultural appropriation from white people in contrast to cultural revenge by Black people, as in hip hop or rap. This would be by far too simple. Why do the notorious Western ideologies only criticize white musicians stealing from Black ones? Even seen from capitalist theory, many well-known rappers and hip-hop vocalists show a strong macho behavior that defies all those feminist critics. Some of them are billionaires. Why is that ignored? Just to say this would be the social revenge is not enough for me. Probably cultural theory must become more individual and less arbitrary. Again, I'm ultimately convinced that with admittedly a few exceptions, the music development in any genre of the world would be less interesting and less creative if those transfer products mentioned above would be forbidden based on a highly questionable idea of a local untouched heritage. We should then more talk on the how it has been done and less about the what has been done. For me, the engagement with music of another culture, which in a way is just an extension of the engagement with the music of some individuals, is by its own nature a mutual process on same level. I love, for example, Balinese like Wayan Berata, the late Wayan Berata. He composes a Balinese waltz using ternary structures in an almost 100% binary musical world. In 1977, it became the starting point of many interesting developments using odd phrasing, meters, juxtapositions, etc. Not every transformation worked, but music always needs its field of experimentation as well. And we should not forget that in the Western world, the whole music history was signified by various types of transfers, starting with the parody mass in the Renaissance until Stravinsky's Pergolesi transformations or the Sinfonia of Luciano Berio. Music about music is in fact a decisive genre in Western music and not only there. Other music cultures may name it differently or not name it at all. And we should never forget that it is also likely that two composers from different cultural realms without contact find to similar results. See once again some of Debussy's music and Javanese gamelan. Even a hybridization, which normally is the result of forced adaptation based on the colonial suppression by a dominant culture, even a hybridization may end up in the independence of an originally hybrid product, becoming a thorough cultural expression of an ethnic group. Indonesia is a goldmine for such music developments. That does not justify colonial behavior. I just want to give a clue on possible developments. In our current now, for me, it is more important to vote and fight for the acceptance of diversity in the sense of Julien's distance, and look what may happen in between. Ongoing accusations regarding cultural appropriations are less helpful because they tend to fix even individual cultural marks, becoming exclusive and normative. I'm convinced that the opposite is necessary and brings us more together without giving up something. Cultural exchange, and I intentionally avoid now the term appropriation, is essential for the survival of humankind, as the world faces problems that cannot be solved locally, even if some centuries or decades ago, dominant cultures have caused irreparable damage. I can only bow my head, apologize, and try to make it better, but I cannot turn time back. Thank you very much.
We're still here, don't worry. So thank you very much, Dieter, for asking questions and also find some solutions to your questions. And it's a really beautiful answer you have given us. And it really reverberates to the talk that Van gave in the morning as well, because he was talking about that the research that has been done in the Philippines, for example, that you have to also ask for the rights to broadcast, to record from the owners of the cultures, and many chances that it happens to be the kind of more bureaucratic or the politics of negotiations that prohibited these types of ongoing growth of music to be continued. And I agree with you in many points that these two polar, either the ideas of like the uniformed, and it's more important about how, not what, that kind of thing. So I think thank you very much for clarifying that. And I think we have a lot of people who would like to join. I can already hear someone say hello in the Zoom. So Yona, if you want to join in, or anyone from in the room.
I'm sorry, I didn't know he was already talking, so I just go back detail. Fascinating topic, actually. A fascinating topic, appropriation, because it's actually still a big issue, but it's an issue on the cerebral level, I guess. In long time ago, when Pak Dieter was young, about 2004, I wrote a dissertation on appropriation, apparently, but my subjects were the small communities from Mindanao who have been disenfranchised from their land and living in the fringes of the city. And I was with Ramon Santos in gathering the data at the time, but apparently in my analysis and my interviews with them is that the notion that those communities who have been disenfranchised from the land, who have been living in the fringes of the city, living have also been appropriating themselves in the sense that they want to use their culture for many perhaps material advantages. There are festivals, and that is organized by the state where they want to participate. So they have to construct their culture, and apparently that notion of appropriation that is simply about the powerful getting from the powerless, I think is a problematic in itself. So that was what I was doing in my dissertation. So apparently, yeah, it's good. I hear this from Dieter, but it's more even so in the issue with regards to appropriation with composers, because we are all appropriating ourselves in a way, and we are appropriating. Well, apparently, I have a talk later, 4:30 in your time, which also is an appropriation, because I wanted to use the forms of Bach, and that's actually an opposite kind of appropriation. So this notion of that simple formulation or simple equation of the powerful getting from the powerless, I think should be addressed. And I think it's a very good thing to talk about this. I've seen a draft of this paper. Pak Dieter honored me so much of giving a draft of the paper some time ago, and I was so thrilled to read it. Thank you very much for this talk.
Yeah, thank you too, Jonas. I was sure that we are more or less in a similar direction, and I think it's good that you mentioned the composers. I think if a composer would not appropriate in a way, he's no composer. Yeah.
Yeah, because Jose Maceda, for example, started from that point of view, but that was, so to say, a necessary evil. We had to address the elitist concert-going public in Manila at the time, in the 60s, who knew about Chopin and Beethoven and all that stuff. And Maceda gives them music from Maguindanao, music from China, and then his own compositions, the Xenakis, and then this kind of appropriation actually was, let's call it, a necessary evil for development in itself, and which produced, well, the subculture which we now call the contemporary composers of Southeast Asia, I guess.
Yeah, and something else, even in every respective culture, looking to the history of one's own culture is in a way also a kind of appropriation.
Yes,
yeah?
that is true.
Never speak about that. Yeah?
There was some discussion over lunch, Cass, if you'd like to join in, about the ideas of ownership. Is that the ideas of ownership is the beginning of these questions about appropriation? Because I mean, for example, because you were mentioning about the powerful and the powerless, the dominant and the minor, those kind of things, which also happen in Western music scales. So I'm not sure whether, is that a part, that's why these kind of ideas of appropriation is becoming problematic or thought of as a negative thing? Is it because of the ownership idea, that someone owns something and then have to be protected of that, and someone is coming to take away? What do you think about that?
That's what Distelhorst means, not only owning in a material sense, but owning as an element of one's culture. You know? And let's take these dreadlocks. Yeah, that would, for him, it's stealing a symbol of a suppressed culture and a symbol that demonstrates this suppressed character. And this is the protest. The dreadlocks are the protest. And if you take that away and make it to your own without protesting, then it would be not very appropriate cultural appropriation. Yeah.
Okay. Cass like to join us a little bit.
One other thing on my lips. Thanks, Professor Mack, for a very, very interesting talk. I missed one word actually in the whole story, and this is actually for me how I have been inspired very often by other cultures and by other things. So the word inspiration, is there place for that, or is inspiration also something negative and naive?
No, I think inspiration is something very important. As an artist, for me, it's important to get inspiration historically, to get inspiration spatially, means geographically, from other cultures. I'm open, and even different genres are sources of inspiration for me. What then is important is when I start to create something for myself, that all these inspirations are melting together, or symbolically I try to forget them, and what then works in my unconscious, I don't know actually. That's something that happens, and I think this is the way how inspiration can be, how shall I put that, can be digested as an artist. And if you, I think it cannot be that as a composer, I have to go into a cave and live in a cave and avoid any kind of contact with other things. I know there are people who think like that, but I think it's completely wrong. Yeah? And it has nothing to do with reality. So inspiration is a very positive aspect of mine. What then would be the question, positive, negative, is what I do with the inspiration. Yeah.
Agree, very much agree. I'm just wondering, like when you're mentioning about the composers, at which point that appropriation becomes creativity?
That is difficult. when it's ugly, call it appropriation. When it's beautiful, it's creativity. Yes.
No, I actually do not dare to answer this question because in a global way. I can only answer it with a concrete example. And that's why I have given these 3 examples where I can really clearly say, this is not, and yeah. So I cannot say there is a limit here, there's a limit here. It depends on the individual case.
So that's why you were talking about this, not uniformity, but the ideas of individuals, not as a creator only, but also as an audience as well. Can audience be acted themselves? Can audience appropriate something? Is it possible for the audience to have committed the act of appropriation?
I would never use the word in connection with the audience, because the audience is just the appreciator of something which I present. So ultimately, I am responsible as the presenter. The audience just digests it again. Yeah? And if someone feels he is being appropriated with something, then he should leave the hall. You know? So the problem is that an audience is, for me, also a very anonymous mass. Yeah? Because everyone has a different background, so everyone has a different way of perception and reception. And as an artist on the stage, I can't play for 2 people and for the others not. I perform for all people, and I must accept that the reactions to that what I present are as diverse as the audience itself is. You know?
Thank you. Sorry for mentioning that questions. I think it was just thinking ahead. There was just one thing that you mentioned at the end, that you can kind of like bow your head and apologize for possibly the past, if there's any act of appropriations. And what do you see as a future or the now onwards for what should we think about the ideas of cultural appropriation now and into the future? Should we continue? Should this word always in the back of our mind every time that we create, or what should we do with it?
Yeah, this we should continue to be occupied with that what Julien called the in-between. And that's where 2 different realms meet and where they exchange each other. We shall not think about the result of it, but we should take more care, continuously more care about this in between. I like that term in between because it's non-concrete enough.
I could totally agree with you, and I have a feeling that there are a lot of things about us and the world or the musical culture that we're facing that is more about the creator relationship with that culture. So we can always readjust, reinvestigate, and reevaluate the distance between us and the culture, and as well as the word appropriation as well. I think sometimes the appropriation is closer to our work, sometimes it's a bit further away, and the levels of appropriation and creativity is how we call change every time, right? Like even in one composers, every time that you created the work, it's changing. So
Yeah.
any other questions, maybe remarks from our audience here? I think we can see someone who's kind of like starting. How about new musical instruments? When you create a new musical instruments or create sounds based, I'm sure you are one of the person who have been writing a lot for Nicophone. Can you
Right.
can you do some appropriation with the musical instrument that is kind of newly invented?
This is no appropriation because there's a new music instrument and it was made to being used as a musical instrument. So what I have to learn is what is the, so to speak, the soul of that instrument, you know, that I'm very sensitive in the aura of music instruments, and that's what I have to learn first. So if it's coming from, if it's an instrument from another culture, like I explained with the gong, yeah, I have to know and to learn what the gong means and what the gong represents. But in the moment I use it, I have to do it with a certain honesty regarding the aura of the instrument and the cultural background this instrument has. And with the Nicophone was just something which in fact was invented because of a need in one of my compositions in 2008, I think. And so it was in a way from the very beginning a very functional instrument that then had been explored by other composers and by myself what we can do with it. So this, I think the word appropriation doesn't fit here for me.
Possibly because you are at the beginning of those creations of the creation of that instruments.
From the very beginning, it's Anatay, from the very beginning, in my opinion, it is also an instrument for anyone else. I don't have an ownership regarding this instrument just because I initiate the creation of it.
Okay, so the reason I'm asking this is because we will get to hear it tomorrow in the evening with your piece. So maybe we can get to hear whether kind of like the ideas of appropriation would happen there, or I mean, what if we're hearing today, then what will happen to us in the next year in our own creation. So I think we are sort of like can gradually move into the next topic. Is there any other questions like our friends would like to ask here? It's been quite a warm weather in Bangkok at the moment, so we really hope that you can join us.
In Germany too.
2 degrees.
I have the van going in my background.
Okay. Oh, very sorry about that. In that case, thank you very much, Dieter, and thank you for starting our first day with such important questions. And I'm sure that we will continue to ask this question for the coming days. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.